All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for everyone that could make it and everyone watching after the fact. We're lucky enough today to have the great Ellen Kirby with us to share a little post-Ignite update, where things are at and where things are going with Azure Local. And don't be afraid to ask the hard questions because we love asking Ellen hard questions anyways. So, Ellen, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and present a really monstrous deck that we may not get all the way through in the time we have. But one thing I am going to do is share our big, huge, ginormous deck, which has like 86 slides in it, with Jeff to distribute to the team, to the attendees as well, so that you all have an opportunity to actually peruse it and get some good insight on some of the more granular details of the things that we're doing within product group. But for the purposes of our session today, I tried to kind of cut out all the fat and just go through some of the more interesting topics. One thing I'll note about this, because I streamlined it, took out a lot of like the little chapters and things, it's going to kind of flow. But you'll notice there'll be places, and I'll try to point them out, where we still have things in preview. But we have, especially since around the September mark of last year, been releasing new features and functions at a pretty good cadence. So I did want to just kind of shout out to everybody that this deck has been updated. That includes everything that we've now put out into GA, as well as we've added some new topics, including a few things that are in this deck that we didn't even have opportunity to get to talk about at Ignite. So I'm going to go ahead and share some of our roadmap plans and some of our more future efforts with the folks that have taken the opportunity to join the call today. You guys will be some of the first customers that have actually seen some of this updated content, because this deck just went live for our own internal field engineers.
So just before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have any questions, feel free to drop them either into the chat, and we'll get to them as best as we can, or otherwise, sometimes you can just raise a hand and ask Ellen a question directly over the air. And we want this to be an interactive conversation, not a one-way webinar. So that's the point of this, is to make sure you guys are educated on the newest stuff with Azure Local, and provide a really good resource for you.
Absolutely. Also happy to follow up on questions after. Try to make sure we leave a little bit of time for just some general Q&A conversation toward the end as well. So I'll try to get through as much of it as I can, but by all means, as Jeff said, feel free to raise hands, drop stuff in chat. I'll try to keep up with some of the chat conversation. But ultimately, and I'm not going to hit too hard on some of this stuff, because I know many of you that are joining the call are familiar with some of these concepts. It's always good to sort of set the stage when you're having these conversations and make sure everybody's on the same page as to what we're talking about. One of the things that Microsoft has really focused on investing in is this concept of an adaptive cloud, in that yes, there's benefits to running workloads in cloud. Yes, there's requirements to keep workloads on-prem. How do we help our customers bridge those gaps, especially when we're seeing so much siloed content? And I think it's not getting better. In a lot of cases, it's gotten worse, because you're seeing people develop new technologies and innovations, and there's not always a good consistency between what stays on-prem, what goes to cloud, who owns what the security posture is. We jokingly talk about, it's that little meme of Spider-Man, everybody pointing at the Spider-Mans, because it does feel like that sometimes when you're operating your IT infrastructure. And what we've been really trying to do is figure out how we help unify that, give you a control plane that you can then leverage role-based access control on to better manage the types of workloads that you need to run on the environment. So the bulk of this conversation today is going to be very specifically around Azure Local, but I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to think about why. Why are we doing this? Why aren't you just moving your workloads into cloud? Why aren't you just doing all the things that we've all been talking about for almost 15 years now, in terms of moving as much as you can into cloud? And the reason is, not everything's ready to go to cloud and may never be ready to go to cloud. And we, as a product group, recognize that, and if anything, have really started to double down on it when you look at the sovereignty and regulatory requirements that are really coming up this year, one of the big areas of focus within product group that we've been looking at is how we help highly regulated industries, how we help countries that need specific sovereign requirements to be able to meet those goals. And one of the big players of that is the infrastructure that they need to run those workloads on. And that's beneficial to those of you that are not even remotely interested and impacted by sovereignty, in that because of the requirements depending on Azure Local for these sovereign opportunities, we all will get the benefit of it, because that means Microsoft is deeper investing in the overall stability, performance, and functionality and feature options within Azure Local as a solution. So the good news is that because of the amount of desire and drive to meet these customer needs, there is a lot of investment and doubling down from Microsoft leadership on providing infrastructure with Azure Local. And our go forward plan is very focused on that, and focused on making sure that our customers get the best experience with Azure Local, whether you're looking at a smaller form factor solution, whether you're looking at more of a traditional model like many of you are doing with DataON today or considering, or you're looking at something that could be a much larger scale. We're really looking at all of those and determining how we best provide you a suite of solutions underneath the umbrella of Azure Local to meet those goals. So when we talk specifically about Azure Local, we are talking about cloud connected infrastructure, which again, I know a lot of you on the call are aware of. But why bother? Like, I had a conversation with a customer this morning where they were like, we're trying to figure out why we don't just bare metal deploy Linux with AKS running on top of it to run these kind of workloads. And that was really shocking to me that people are still feeling that way. But I also looked at it and thought, you know, at the same time, yes, why aren't you doing that? And a lot of people are looking at this going, well, is it too expensive? Is there too many different operational things I have to learn that's new and different from what I've been doing before? Where's the benefit and the value add? And for me, the way I answer that is a lot of this slide right here, because by bringing the Arc control plane into the conversation, you're now able to utilize functions and services that have traditionally only been available in cloud down onto Azure Local. So that means that we can really provide a lot more value in the overall security posture, the overall lifecycle management, the overall deployment and provisioning of these solutions, because you are now extending all of those rich Azure features down on-prem with the Azure Local solution. So when we talk about Azure Local, we actually have a couple different flavors of it. One is connected and one is disconnected. Most of you are probably very familiar with connected. It's been around a while. Even the rebranding of Azure Stack HCI to Azure Local at Ignite 2024 didn't bring this as a new thing. This is something that we've been working on since really December of 2020 was when we did the initial GA of Azure Stack HCI. It's always been positioned as a connected solution so that you can use that value of the control plane in the cloud, but then run those workloads and the overall management of those workloads where they need to be. So that separation of workloads can run on-prem on infrastructure that you choose from DataON, and then you have the control plane in the cloud. Well, what we found is that there are customers that for one reason or another really need to be fully air-gapped and disconnected. So what we've actually now done, and it's in private, or excuse me, it just dropped public preview. And in fact, we just sent announcements out on Monday that it is in full public preview. So that is something that you can look at for a full air-gapped solution, which basically takes the value of Azure Local and a certain subset of those services that you run on that Azure Arc control plane and brings them on premise. So we talked about it a little bit at Ignite in November, but this is an expansion of that. This is to deliver on those sovereign needs, but also to deliver for customers that have those requirements. Oh, does somebody have a question? Okay. So most of us are familiar with how Azure Local is working connected, in that you're buying your hardware from DataON, they're helping you provision it and get it deployed from the cloud, and then you're able to deploy applications with that cloud consistent experience, whether you're deploying traditional VMs or you're deploying Kubernetes workloads. The other big thing is because, again, you're using that Arc control plane, you're getting all that functionality of management and security. You're getting unified management. You're getting that visualization of all your resourcing. So that's where truly that value gets added. And again, like I mentioned with the disconnected offering, we take certain subsets of those. And I do have a slide in this deck that we'll hit in a little bit that talk about the different limitations that you get when you do run in a disconnected configuration. But we are working very hard to meet the different customer needs. So again, you have connected to Azure, you have disconnected capabilities. And so we are looking at this holistically as a way for our customers to meet those needs, whether they're doing a single node or going all the way up. You can see right here, we didn't really talk about this in Ignite. This is kind of hopefully some new and interesting information for you all. The multiple rack clustered solution, which is now in preview, which gives us the ability to scale exponentially from a node count perspective comparatively to what you would traditionally see in that middle ring, which is our typical Azure local deployment today with the Windows Server, failover cluster manager, backend kernel architecture, as well as the typical storage spaces direct. We're now scaling into things like SAN attached storage and racks of solutions that meet customer needs when you're starting to talk about a lot of dense workloads that cannot, for one reason or another, run to cloud. This doesn't meet a lot of our customers' requirements from the perspective of most customers don't need anything that big, but there are certainly some that do, and we're really, again, trying to expand Azure Local's capabilities. And our investment should hopefully help folks feel comfortable with the fact that this is a technology that we are going to continue to evolve and add new functionality to. This is just a little bit of a look at a traditional Azure Local solution reference architecture. Again, I'll be sharing these slides so you can peruse them at your own time. But this is just sort of that example of what you would see with the Azure Local scaling of 1 to 16. That's your traditional configuration. That's with the storage spaces direct. And again, this is what we've been running for about 5 years when you look at the architecture. And even beyond that, if you go back to the Windows Server Storage Spaces Direct days, we've had this architecture in place for a while. So what we're evolving to is not reducing this capability, but adding more flexibility for customers that do need SAN attached or do need a larger scale deployment. All right, I'm going to bring up my iChart slide. This has been up. I update this every time we update this deck, and it is painful to look at it first, but so helpful as a reference in that it helps you understand the suites of services and capabilities in cloud that customers are running today and what subsets of those can actually run on Azure Local. Because I think sometimes people hear, oh, I can extend all the Azure services down to Azure Local. And there is a little bit of nuance to that because some of those services have been paved to be able to run on Azure Local, both connected and disconnected. And other services are not there at this point in time for one reason or another. A good example of that is Azure Virtual Desktop. Azure Virtual Desktop does, you'll notice, deploy on top of Azure Local, but its control plane is fully handled in the cloud. So therefore, when you look at the difference between an Azure Local connected and a disconnected, you'll see that the virtual desktop capabilities are not on the disconnected model because we have no way to bring that full Azure Virtual Desktop control plane down to a totally disconnected solution today. I don't know the future yet, but that's where we are right now. So this, for me, is a great reference slide. If in a couple of weeks or months you think, boy, somebody asked me about functions or somebody asked me about OpenAI, what things can I actually run on-prem that I have traditionally been able to only run in cloud? And this hopefully helps everybody sort of set realistic expectations about what can and cannot be done. I will also say that this constantly changes. So I update this deck every 3 months. I'm constantly modifying this slide because our partners across the organization are continuing to see the value in extending their services down on-prem with Azure Local. So I'm going to pause for a quick second because I'm going to just really quickly highlight a few workloads, but I just was going to check and see if anybody has any questions overall about the solution, because the rest of this particular deck is primarily going to focus on what you can and cannot, what you can do ultimately today, and then what's roadmapped for the future. Okay. So most of you are very familiar with Azure Local Virtual Machines and the ability to deploy and manage those from the cloud experience. This has been here for quite a while. I'm not going to rat hole on this particular slide, but I did want to include it because you'll notice that when you click over and look at the Kubernetes capabilities, they mirror, they're the same thing. And of course, Kubernetes has no additional cost. It's all built into the cost of the Azure Local experience. So going back to that scenario with the customer I talked to earlier today that was like, why shouldn't I just run AKS bare metal? Or run some type of Kubernetes deployment bare metal? Why would I do this? It's the benefit, the value add of the management experience from the security layer and posturing to the control plane itself. Same thing goes for Azure Virtual Desktop. This has been around for a while too. For those of you that maybe read or heard about the Azure Virtual Desktop hybrid announcements that happened at Ignite, where folks started walking around going, you don't need Azure Local anymore. You can run Azure Virtual Desktop on Windows Server. How great is that? There is some restrictions around that because yes, you can bring Azure Virtual Desktop down to Windows Server or down to VMware, but you don't get all of the functionality that you see here. For example, one of the big limitations is you don't get all of the capabilities for being able to do multi-session. So that means that you can't run a Windows 10 or Windows 11, hopefully, endpoint on there and have multiple users connecting to it if you're doing the Azure Virtual Desktop hybrid model. If you want to run AVD on-prem and get all that benefit of the density of multi-session, as well as all of the latency and the short paths and things, all of that functionality is baked into the underlying capabilities of Azure Local itself. So there is some distinction. So if you are looking at Azure Virtual Desktop and thinking, well, I don't need to go to Azure Local, I can run it, be very wary of that because yes, it does have that capability, but does not have everything that you're seeing listed out here. The other thing that we've announced is Microsoft 365 Local. This is a funny one because you'll notice that Skype for Business is on here. That's because Teams cannot be encapsulated and running completely disconnected at this point in time. If the Teams team decides that they're going to do that ultimately, that's fantastic. We'll support them. But right now, what Microsoft 365 Local is doing is meeting those sovereign needs to stay completely disconnected and air-gapped. So we do have a couple flavors of it, but ultimately it gives our customers the ability to run Exchange, SharePoint, and Skype for Business so that they can run all of the 365 capabilities without having to be connected to cloud. So again, if you're in an environment where you're getting restrictions because of data sovereignty and having to be careful about the types of workloads and data transmissions that are happening outside a country, this is something that we're getting asked for, especially in a lot of the European markets. So it is something that we've invested in, and again, is proprietarily running on top of Azure Local. Another thing that we have been focusing on is continuing the investments with GPUs. So that means we're bringing additional platforms for NVIDIA, including the RTX Pro 6000 to the Azure Local solution. That has been announced. That is something that you can purchase as part of your overall hardware experience. We are seeing more and more customers use cases for running Azure Local on-prem, drawing dependencies from GPUs, because a lot of times that kind of high performance stuff that you don't want to bring up to cloud because of real-time requirements and a myriad of other reasons. This is one of the areas where we've continued to invest in that. So maximizing AI ML performance, really bringing those capabilities with like VDI workloads and things like that to the edge. That is something that we're continuing to invest in. So there will continue to be more GPU capable platforms, even beyond the NVIDIA partnership, as the product evolves and as more customers have demand for AI and ML at the edge. We have talked about software-defined networking. What's really exciting about this slide is this is one of the first times I'm getting to present it with none of this having preview stickers on it, because all of this stuff is now fully GA'd and ready to go for you. That's been a really big deal because I think software-defined networking has always been a great idea, but then the reality of it, the practicality of it tends to stop customers in tracks because there was so much complexity to it, especially things like the specific need to be able to run like network security groups and isolate the traffic. And a lot of that had to be very command line heavy, had to be very, you had to be very deep in the network architecture in order to do that. And what we've really brought forward with this is the capability for you to take advantage of all of this and do it all from the cloud control plane. That was a big undertaking. It took a very long time. Big shout out to Kyle Bisnet and the team over in the networking group that continue to drive this forward so that we could make these capabilities available to customers. But again, it's another scenario where, yes, you could do SDN. You've been able to do SDN for years, but the reality of actually doing it successfully and doing it in a way that's manageable from not just day 1, but day 300, day 500, that's what we're really bringing by giving you this experience to be able to manage and customize from the portal. Another thing that GA'd late last year was the Azure Arc Gateway. I've been working with customers that have actually been running this for quite some time, but the fact that it's now fully GA'd and available for you to be able to use is extremely helpful. If you go back a year, 2 years, it was a painful experience to deploy Azure Local when you had to get with your security team and open potentially hundreds of endpoints. Now that you can leverage the Arc Gateway and use that to route the enterprise firewall proxy less than 24 or so endpoints through to the Arc Gateway, and then the Arc Gateway is going to route all of those traffic requirements for you, reduces the operational overhead, improves the security experience, and you're not having to go running to the network team and security teams to open endpoints every time any adjustments are made, because that's all managed at the gateway level from within Azure. And this, again, simplifies everything down and creates a management experience that, for our goal, much like what I was talking about with the network security groups, gives a typical customer the ability to deploy this without needing to have a PhD in how to deploy Azure Local. Couple things that we're actually about to GA, getting super close on, is the site recovery capability and specifically the rack-aware clustering capability. So I do want to talk about those a little bit, but I wanted to point out that we, of course, have support for MABs, we have support for V Replica, and we're doing a lot of work with partners like Veeam and Commvault and Rubrik around being able to integrate the hydration capabilities for Azure Arc directly into their solutions. So let's say you use Veeam for your VCDR strategy, and you want to make sure that whatever you back up and recover actually resolves appropriately in the Azure Arc portal once everything has been failed over or failed back. That's one of the things that our teams are heavily investing in, is making sure our solution partners are able to provide you something that's going to have the granularity that you need in terms of what to back up, where, and how, but also the recoverability of being integrated into the Azure Local experience so you don't lose any of that Arc management in the event of a DR situation. So this one is really exciting. I'm super excited about the stuff that we're doing with our partners, because I think there's so much more value to that. But again, if you want to do it first party, we do have MABs, we do have some capabilities already with site recovery. We specifically are working on adding more of that simplified portal experience as well. So again, this is an example of what site recovery looks like. You're welcome to peruse this. You can see it's in preview, but this does give you the capability to manage all the failover and failback from the portal experience. The other, again, is that resiliency with Storage Spaces Direct. I think most people probably are pretty comfortable with this. We've been doing this for a really long time. This is, a great just bare bones solution as it sits with the way that the storage is leveraged in order to provide cost, affordability, and performance at a balance that you need. And there's all these different resiliency levels. But one of the things that we have found talking to customers is they need more capabilities, they need more availability, they need more redundancy. So we've invested in rack-aware clusters as well. This is actually in its final preview. It is still currently slated to GA next month. It is possible it'll slip into the April drop, but I think right now it is still locked into GA in February. What's really exciting about this is it's giving you the one logical Azure Local deployment that is distributed between 2 different racks with 2 different top of rack switches, and being able to set your different affinities and availability zones so that you can fail the specific things back and forth that you need to. We got really pushed on by our manufacturing customers on this particular ask, because most manufacturing sites have a lot of work that they can't even be down seconds. And so they're looking for extra layers of availability. And that's something that we wanted to make sure we delivered and thought about in the right way. I don't look at this as a replacement for Stretch, because it's not, but it is a way forward for customers that need that level of redundancy in those locations. And I'm actually going to hit a little bit on what we're doing for hydration, and I'm also going to hit a little bit on migration here in just a second. So hopefully, Mohammed, I'll answer those questions for you, but if I don't, feel free to come off mute and grill me on them here in a few minutes. And again, I get customers asking me all the time, how do we do migrations? How do we do all of that? It's so interesting because sometimes it's hard to find live migration information, because I think if you're coming from VMware, you're used to it somewhat at times being a little bit manual, how you move workloads around. And what we've done with Azure Local specifically is really try to make the experience be handled primarily by the actual solution itself. I do want to very, very quickly, before we get into a few other things, also just point out some of the security posturing that we've really been focused on over the last few years. There are a few in particular I wanted to hit on. We've actually recently merged the security teams into our engineering team, which is really fantastic because that means we've got a lot of direct line to them. And I'm actually in the middle of kicking off an investigation to look at customers' real use cases and needs for both trusted launch VMs and confidential compute. But with the trusted launch VMs, the ability to secure boot, the ability to have that boot integrity and to use the attestation service and verifying it with the TVM components has been a big ask for a while. There are a lot of really good value adds to this. But when this doesn't solve all your problems, the other is the confidential computing. So being able to do hardware enforced isolation. We have done a ton of work on confidential compute, because I know personally when I looked at this several years ago, the performance hit just was too much to be able to look at confidential compute as a workable solution. And they've really done a ton to bring down the performance hits that happen if you enable confidential compute. So I'm very, very excited for what the next year is going to bring us with this new security team folding into our organization, because it's going to give us the ability to target the specific things that you as customers need and making sure that we're prioritizing those deliveries. So you can see they're in preview, but we are ready to learn more about what customers need around trusted launch and around confidential compute so that we can shape the products appropriately for your needs. The other is a pretty exciting one that I think has flown under the radar a little bit, but a lot of customers are very interested in. It is in final private preview. It's about to go public preview, and that's local identity without Active Directory. So the ability to deploy Azure Local without requiring any kind of AD connectivity. And so your hosts aren't domain joined. You actually are using the key vault for the local user passwords and BitLocker recovery keys. So all of that is all happening so that you're able to run these solutions, especially if you're looking at those edge, really lightweight deployments without having to have all of those additional capabilities and functions of specifically the Active Directory to manage all of that. So you still need identity management. You have DNS options. We've actually just recently in this last preview enabled the capability to do built-in DNS support. So you don't have to have your own DNS anymore, but you can. So I've seen customers deploy that both ways. This is something that is about to go public preview. So if it's something that you think would be a value add for you, I highly recommend keeping an eye out for that. Because I think, again, when you're doing a lot of scale at the edge, you're doing lots of different small clusters, this becomes a really critical piece of simplifying your overall deployment strategy. I've talked about Sovereign. I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on it, but for our international folks, this has definitely been something that we're hearing a lot. There's a lot of buzz where we've talked about AI for years. I think Sovereign is the big buzzword this year. I'm going to mention it. You guys are going to start noticing it in a lot of our public-facing content. But you have a couple different things when we talk about Sovereign. You have a Sovereign public cloud, you have the national partner clouds, and you have a sovereign private cloud. And where Azure Local fits into the story is the customers that are demanding their own private cloud, because we can then bring those capabilities like Microsoft 365 Local down onto and running on top of the Azure Local deployments for these customers that need that full sovereign private cloud solution. Another that I mentioned before is the disconnected operations, like I said, and if you hear anybody refer to it as ALDO, that is the short name for it. I don't know why we call it ALDO, except of course ALDO, but it sort of is funny to hear everybody talk about ALDO like he's a guy down the hall that works, somewhere, but Without Azure Local Disconnected Operations, like I said, there are a subset of those services and features that are not going to be brought down anytime soon. That big slide, I think, does a good job of representing it. But just so that you all can see, we do have subsets of services that are available for you to be able to run in a completely disconnected configuration. Today, it is a permanently disconnected solution. That means if you run Azure Local Disconnected Operations or ALDO, you are choosing to run it completely disconnected. So there are specific pathways you have to take to update it and patch manage it, but it is not requiring any connectivity to cloud. If you are running in a traditional Azure Local configuration, you are fully capable of getting disconnected, but that doesn't mean you're running an Azure Local disconnected solution. Those are two different versions that you choose to deploy when you're actually deploying your cluster. And then here's a good example of the control plane that you would use to run a disconnected solution. So this is in final public preview. Excited to see this coming out here later this year. Again, we've done a lot of work with the cloud control plane. We've been deploying with a distributed model now for over a year, but we're continuing to make improvements on it. We're deploying the infrastructure updates. We've invested a lot in the update manager experience. So as we have continued to evolve the solution, we're really trying to add more functionality to that to create a better experience for you so that hopefully when you're using Azure Update Manager, you're starting to feel like you can get rid of the old SCCM and WSUS solutions as you move forward in managing not just the host, but the workloads on them too. Another thing that we did announce at Ignite is some additional dashboarding that we built for the solution. So we've added some new ready-made dashboards to give you multi-cluster viewing from the Azure portal experience. Anybody in your environment that's well tuned on Azure management and knows how to use those tools, like the log analytics workspace and things like that, can certainly customize like in Kustos and stuff like that and make your own configurations. But we've listened to a lot of customers on what those metrics should look like, how they want to see the dashboards, and we've given you quite a few canned and ready to go that you can then modify to meet your needs. We've also been investing a lot in Copilot. So even going back a couple months to a year, you would get completely different answers if you ask specific questions within Copilot from the portal experience. And as it's learning, as more customers are interacting with it and using it, we're getting better information. I think one area in particular I use it the most is in the code generation, because if I am not 100% certain how to do something, being able to ask Copilot specifically what to do and having it spit me out the code gets me 80 to 90% of the way. That's just saving so much time and cycling to be able to do that. But you can use it for a lot of other things too, like just overall understanding of your environment and making sure that it's optimized in the right way for you. Another piece of the puzzle that I think is really important is understanding what the options are for our VMware customers. We did make a ton of announcements at Ignite that maybe made it a little bit fuzzier as to whether you use Windows Server or Azure Local. So I tried to streamline the feedback that we got from folks on that experience and make it a little bit more concise. Where I did that specifically was this slide, which you guys are welcome to take a look at and digest, and then reach back out to the team if you've got questions. I'm certainly happy to follow up with any kind of specific particulars, but I want to point out a few things in here. Prior to our Ignite announcements, we did not have SAN support at all for Azure Local. Now you can see we're supporting fiber channel SAN storage on validated hardware. You can also see that we had virtual desktop and we didn't have it on Windows Server, and now we support virtual desktop for hybrid. So you can see that there is some places where it becomes a little bit fuzzier as to which one to use, and some places where I think it's clearer on which one to use. But ultimately, the litmus test I give most customers is, are you using Azure today? Do you have some workloads in Azure? Do you understand Azure management? Are you comfortable with the Azure experience? Because if you are, you answer yes to those things, extending those skills and capabilities to manage your workloads on-prem becomes a much easier choice with the way that we have been positioning Azure Local to be that infrastructure on-prem solution for you. Okay, I know there were some questions about Migrate. Azure Migrate did go GA. in September of last year. It does allow you to move your workloads from VMware to Azure Local. So that is now fully GA'd and ready to go for you. One area where we are in final preview is the ability to actually do this with private endpoints. So we will also be continuing to add value to the migrate experience and add functionality. And one of those areas is if you do need a private endpoint experience to migrate your VMware VMDKs over to Azure Local and how that works. A big thing for customers that maybe aren't familiar with this is because it is managed all from the cloud experience, it gives you that flexibility, but all of the actual migration itself stays on-prem. So what took us a really long time to get out and available and GA'd to customers is the ability to do all of this without all of that data having to go back up to Azure and then get deployed back down. So ultimately, we've now given you a solution that, though it does require a minimal amount of downtime, and your mileage varies depending on the type of VM that you're migrating over, you have this capability to now migrate traditional VMware VMDKs over to Azure Local, and that does that all and gets the agent all replaced, puts the Azure Arc agent on there, and gets you positioned to be successful deploying on top of Azure Local moving forward. The other question was about hydration. So it's really funny. We talk about Hydrate. We've talked about Hydrate a bunch, and now it gets called VMware Guest Management Enablement, which is absolutely Hydrate. The fun one is we also refer to it as repatriatizing your VMs when they migrate over. I love how as a product team, we have 8 different names for what this technology is, but ultimately what we've been focused on is the ability to bring your VMs into the Azure Local Arc experience. And by doing that and being able to move those workloads around, it gives you the capability to be more fluid with where your VMs are running. One of the things that we positioned on here was leveraging heavily the control plane that we have embedded into the Azure Resource Bridge appliance, which is what gives you the capabilities to run your workloads in the control plane or manage them from the control plane and run them on-prem. And what we've done with this is we've taken advantage of that to be able to re-register those VMs when they move from one place to another in a way that's automatic. What we did do is we've worked heavily with, again, like I was mentioning before, Veeam, Commvault, Rubrik, and other backup disaster recovery providers to position this capability integrated into their solution first, because we got a lot of feedback from customers that, hey, we need to hydrate, we need to move this stuff, but we want a way to do this where we're actually using it in line with the rest of our BCDR strategy. So we prioritized making it work for our partners first. And then as we're making improvements to the resource bridge by revamping the dependencies we have on mock in that operating system that's running the resource bridge, we will actually reduce down the complexity of this even further. So look for later this year to have great new announcements on the capabilities of the guest management with the updates that we're making in the resource bridge specifically. I've mentioned it a few times. I did want to point out external storage for Azure Local. Couple things to be aware of if you light up and think, ooh, I want external storage attached to this. It is a bring your own SAN storage solution, so you keep that operational control with the SAN solution partner. We do have a couple specific limitations. One is it has to be fiber channel connected today, and the other is you cannot have it a boot from SAN configuration. You do have to have the hard drive on the solution itself to be able to boot from with the OS for the Azure Local deployment on your nodes. We do not support and don't have plans at this moment to support a boot from SAN. So bear that in mind when you're looking at your existing hardware and thinking, maybe I could refactor all this to be Azure Local. There are going to be some limitations to that. So just definitely reach out if you have questions or check in with us because there are going to be some really good announcements coming up when this GA is here in a couple months that will talk through and give you details on what can and cannot be used and what those limitations will look like. The other is, of course, the big multi-rack deployment. So again, I just want to point out we've talked a lot about all these capabilities and features when it talks about scaling between 1 and 16 nodes. What if that's not enough? And so this is going to scale up into the hundreds of nodes per instance and give you integrated capabilities for compute, storage, and networking. We've seen this getting adopted by big like hosters and telecom providers that are looking for that level of density. Again, it's not something that is going to be necessary for most of our customers, but it is something that we've invested with since the Nessus for Operators team merged into our organization, so that we can provide you flexibility in terms of how you want to scale Azure Local. And then, of course, we are bringing a lot of AI solutions down to the edge. That big slide, the eye chart slide, had a lot of this, but just to point out, we're continuing to make a ton of investments in AI services like Video Indexer, Edge RAG, Bring Your Own RAG, being able to bring Foundry capabilities down on-prem, leveraging those investments in those NVIDIA GPUs, and having a lot of our different partners leading the way when it comes to being able to provide those solutions. So you have things like intelligence knowledge handling, chatbots, things like that. The ability to bring those down on-prem is there. That's in preview. So is the Vision AI Video Indexer. We actually demoed this at our Ignite booth. It's a really interesting thing to see how the modeling is being leveraged and used, and all the use cases in factories and retail and others where customers are looking for ways to run and utilize these things. We do have that team building out those technologies specifically to run on Azure Local. And then, of course, the ability to bring Foundry capabilities and integrate the on-prem and cloud together so that you can leverage and take advantage of Foundry in terms of modeling and fine-tuning. So I spat out a lot of information because I wanted to make sure I gave us a good 15 minutes to talk about things that are specifically valuable to you. And again, I will share this deck. I will actually share a much bigger version of this deck. Feel free to peruse it, ask questions, come back to us and go, this doesn't make sense to me. We love to hear your feedback. But I do want to kind of land a couple things. One is, over the last few years, we've made a ton of investment in Azure Local as a solution. So we've brought a lot of core capabilities into the solution. We're bringing AI ML workloads at the edge. We've delivered Azure virtual desktops. We've brought a lot of flexibility in terms of partners like DataON being able to provide you a catalog of different solution hardware that they can bring to the table for you to run Azure Local in a way that makes sense for your business. We've also added a lot of tooling capabilities, extended our monitoring and visibility, added all the templates so that you can automate and do things with Bicep and ARM. And we've really driven from our partners like DataON the ability for your firmware driver validation to be integrated into your ARC management experience. And that's something that adds tremendous value and reduces overall management of the solution. I see the difference in the customers that are using solutions like DataON with all of those functionalities in place and being able to monitor and do their firmware driver updates and get their SPEs in place, versus customers that are kind of doing it that bring your own do-it-yourself model and the struggles that they have. So it does make a difference. Your mileage does vary in terms of what you choose to use from a hardware partner solution. And then again, we've added additional security flavor. We're bringing more to the solution. We've added more Defender integration. We're adding things like confidential compute and trusted launch VMs to give you a more span of control when it comes to how you want to layer your security and compliance. And then this is the one that everybody listened to me talk for a bunch of time to get to this slide right here, which is our roadmap slide. And specifically, it talks about some of the things that I've hit on today and also a few other things. So things like being able to use Arc Gateway for AKS is coming out the first half of this year. We do have Arc Gateway already for the hosts themselves, but adding our gateway capabilities to all the workloads that you run on top of the solution is critical to reduce that complexity. We're bringing zero-touch provisioning into the solution, especially around our small form factor offerings. That is in private preview 3, and expect it to public preview in the next few months, with a GA scheduled for sometime late summer, early fall. The other things like hydrating pre-existing VMs into Azure Arc is expected to GA the latter half of this year, but we do have that integrated work with our partners like Veeam and Commvault and Rubrik that are actually scheduled to GA even earlier. I think right now Veeam is looking at end of March to have that capability lit up for you to be able to use their solution to automatically move your machines and workloads around in a disaster recovery scenario. The other kind of things I want to point out on here are those rack-aware clustering things, like I mentioned. That's in final preview and expected to GA in the next few months. Same with disconnected operations in public preview now, expected to GA very soon. We've also got the multi-rack stuff. I'm actually working with one of the engineers on the multi-rack to test out a couple scenarios tomorrow. That's my lab day tomorrow, is doing stuff with multi-rack. So it's very, very much coming soon. The support for the external SAN is already in public preview and expected to GA here in the next few months. If I can kind of hit one thing home, we're not resting on our laurels. We are not stopping on improving new features and functions, but we're also extremely focused on how we continue to make this a stable and reliable platform. So a lot of our investment is in making sure that our updates become less and less impactful, and that you get to a comfort level with them, that you feel like you can run this solution without having to spend the time and resources that I think it has been required to run it over the last few years. So I got a lot done in 45 minutes, but I want to give everybody a little bit of time, ask some questions in the chat, see if we can attack a couple of those in particular. Mohammed, I think I answered your hydration question, but if there's other things that you want to ask specifically, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, we can just go down the list of questions posted in chat. Anybody have any on fire? Jacob, anybody?
No, I was going to ask you about the updates, but you kind of addressed that. I mean, lots of great stuff for people that have been kind of looking, waiting. I think the biggest one for the existing customers that have been using the product for the last year is, last time you talked about, hey, we're doing a ton of work to make updates more reliable.
Yes.
Just kind of how that's been going from a telemetry and global user standpoint.
Yep. Yeah, from a telemetry standpoint, we're tracking so much better now. But I do want to say that one of the challenges is getting the customers to that stability point. And so if you're running an environment today where you haven't upgraded to at least 2510, which was the October drop, you are probably still in a little bit of pain, still struggling a little bit. Once you get to that point where whether you started at 24H2 or you have been on a predecessor, merging those operating systems and getting to a point where you're now at the modern operating system, and when you get the latest updates, you're not going through the impact of potentially being on an older solution. That actually is a pretty big game changer for us in terms of guaranteeing better levels of telemetry and stability. So when we look at the customers that are like updating and updated to 2511 and 2512, and when we're getting ready to release 2601 on the 20th, the telemetry looks fantastic. The problem is we still have a bunch of customers that need to come along for the ride and get through the pain points of especially that October release, where we have finally merged the operating systems and getting everybody to the modern release.
Thank you. Anyway, jump a couple and do Philip's question. Really interesting question. So, I mean, yeah, the two choices are really AD or local identity.
Yep.
The question is the potential of using Entra ID.
So Entra ID, of course, can be used for certain workloads, like AVD has some support for that. You can run Entra ID for some of your workloads on AKS as well. When it comes to actually managing the host, because of the complexity of needing to actually manage services within like the cluster management and things like that, I don't expect there to be an Entra ID way to do a complete Azure Local solution anytime soon. That's why we invested in bringing those local identities managed by the Key Vault to be able to get rid of those AD dependencies, because at the backside of all of this, you still have services like Failover Cluster Manager that have requirements around the servicing and identities and permissions. And so therefore, we've had to make sure that all of that stuff is going to work appropriately. And that's where we brought in that AD list solution as a way for customers to not have that dependency on a full-blown Active Directory. But for identity management, when it comes to the applications that you're running on top of the solution, you do have Entra ID and other opportunities in terms of how you want to manage those. Did I answer that one, Jacob?
I think that was a pretty good answer.
Okay.
Philip can speak up if not. But the next one is roadmap for iSCSI support.
iSCSI is being talked about. We had to draw a little bit of a line in the sand when it came to what we initially wanted to support. And what we found talking to our hardware partners that deliver SAN is that they primarily wanted us to focus on the fiber channel first. I do expect iSCSI to happen as a later step. It has been asked for. I do expect it to come, but fiber channel was the first one out the gate, much like when we talk about migrating from VMware. Well, how come we're not migrating from Hyper-V? The drive, the requirements, the volume of customers looking for it, prioritize the fiber channel, and we want to get that out to everybody as quickly as possible. But look for iSCSI as a V2 and beyond.
Next one was a question I don't know if you can answer.
Okay.
Is Dell Druva working with you on the hydration side of things?
No, I don't have Druva on the list as of right now. If that's something that you need, Sean, feel free to reach out to your Dell team and also drop a line to us. Let us know, because that is something that we can look into. What we did is basically did an open call to all of our partners that do BCDR and recommended that they work with us for the code integration to do the Azure Arc. But I don't believe Druva was on the list. We do others. The big three I mentioned, but we've also worked with Cohesity and others. I am not aware of Dell Druva on that list right now, but I can certainly find out for you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Patrick, do you want to verbally say your question about low capacity Azure Local and what you're looking for there?
Yes. In fact, last year or end of 2024, there was some post about low capacity deployment of Azure Local for small environments with lowest requirement about disk and stuff like that, like having two small servers doing mirroring and stuff like that. Anything news about that? Because I see on learn.microsoft.com that it's still in preview since like 1 year, and we didn't see much news about that.
Yep, it has been entirely reworked. And so for those of you that have been along for this ride for a long time, you're probably very familiar with Cosmos Darwin. He was sort of the godfather of Azure Stack HCI, delivered the Azure Local, and he's actually left the Azure Local specific team, and he's moved in to that small form factor planning. And they've gone kind of a little bit back to the drawing board since he took it over last year and looked at how they want to deliver that as sort of almost a bare metal Azure Linux experience that runs AKS workloads on super small factor and gives you a lot of flexibility. We have about a dozen customers in the final private preview 3 that's happening right now. In fact, we just dropped it about 10 days ago. And once we get past private preview 3, there will be some public announcements. What will become very public with a lot of detailing around the small form factor offering and the capabilities is going to be in that timeframe of Microsoft Build. So at that point, you'll see a lot more public announcements. But the backgrounder as to why you haven't seen a lot of announcements on it, and I sort of lightly mentioned it throughout this deck, is because it was completely revamped and reworked to be a more efficient way for customers to deliver at a very light weight. And we've been working with partners like Nook and Asus and others to start really, really small, like less than sub $1,000 to be able to get these boxes out the door to you and run as primarily containerized workloads.
Thank you.
Next one from Philip. Guessing he's asking about the NVMe-OF support for SANs.
So I have not heard if NVMe or Fiber Channel over Ethernet are going to end up on the roadmap after iSCSI. The ones that I'm very clear on are the Fiber Channel as the V1 and the iSCSI as kind of the next one they're going to attack. We need to hear from you guys what you need. So if that's something that you're looking for, I'm definitely happy to flag that as we consider what we want to support as we build out the capabilities of the solution. Okay, looks like there are a few questions here. There any others in particular you want me to attack, Jacob?
Looks like Mohammed did a question on the requirements for M365 on local, which I know that's a pretty big question.
No, it is, but it's also a good question in that we aren't limiting this to enterprise customers because we have customers living in sovereign countries that just absolutely, and I'm not trying to get into political climate here, they cannot run any of their solution in cloud because there are challenges with the US and the cloud. So one of the things that we've been focused on is how we help those customers, and it is not limited to enterprise. I will say this, to actually realistically run the M365 solution on Azure Local, it's a much beefier deployment than what we've been talking about, that what you typically would see on these solutions today. So where we're seeing customers start to do it is moving past that midline and in some cases into that rack scale stuff I was talking about, the multi-racks where you're having lots and lots of solution. It comes down to the overall workloads that you're going to run. So just because you say you're going to run M365 doesn't mean you're going to run Exchange, SharePoint, and Skype. There may be components of that. What we have tried not to do is limit what you can and cannot run on the different flavors of Azure Local. The limitations come at the hardware level and at what benchmark you chose to deploy Azure Local. So it looks like Adam just added another M365 question about a friend that is a government customer that has been searching for a replacement due to end of life. Microsoft was going to end of life Skype for Business. They have extended it. Yes. If you guys read between the lines, you can see it. Teams was built to be a cloud solution and a cloud experience. And therefore, nobody in Teams looked at this and said, we need to be able to lift this whole thing and let people run it completely on-prem. Nobody considered that. So what we've done is we've said, look, maybe at some point we will finally sunset Skype and move everybody to Teams. But right now we can't because too many customers, especially in that sovereign requirement, are having to run a messaging solution completely encapsulated, and Teams can't do that today. Will they eventually? I would guess there's a lot of mandates happening at the Satya level down to get Teams to be able to run in a completely disconnected configuration. But yes, to your point, Adam, they're going to have to extend that end of life because it's the only way we can actually provide a messaging solution completely disconnected today. Any other questions that we missed from the chat? Oh, looks like we got some hands up. Sean, maybe?
Yep. I'm working in an educational environment where we're cloud first, everything, Enter ID only. Is this local identity without Active Directory? The only reason we're running Active Directory right now is because of Azure Local. Is this a possibility where we actually take down our Active Directory and just use this solution moving forward when this is fully developed?
Absolutely, and it is actually fully developed and should GA here very, very soon. But what I will, and it is in public preview, so you can try it out. But if you are looking at this solution, and the only caveat I'll give to that is Active Directory. As long as none of the other applications that you're running are depending on Active Directory for any kind of dependencies, then you're in good shape. The first half of this year, we'll have a release of the local identity without Active Directory. And that will mean we will remove the dependency for you having to have Active Directory to run Azure Local in terms of the clusters and the cluster management. But if you're using Active Directory in any way to manage the identity and authentication for the workloads, that's another kind of thing you have to think about.
Okay, thank you. Any documentation specifically I can go look that up at, or?
Absolutely. Yep, yeah. I'll be happy to post it in the chat. The Azure Local AD list solution. I think we keep calling it AD list inside, but it's called Local Identity without Active Directory for Azure Local.
Thank you.
And
such a great name.
Unless there's a really new update, it's a full wipe and rebuild. no in-place conversion.
It's not going to brownfield, at least to start with. So you would have to redeploy the clusters because of the just intrinsic part of the setup that is required in order to do that, where you're creating all those identities and creating the key vault and configuration. I think eventually we'll give you a brownfield scenario, but yes, you're right, Jake, about the gate. It will be a redeploy.
Thank you very much.
Carl.
Hello, thank you, Ellen. Wonderful presentation. 2 questions from here. So I was excited to hear news about the hydration and how it's going on. Not seeing this on a product roadmap, is it? So I don't think I see the hydration on the roadmap.
Look at the second section where it says ready for all your apps, VMs, and containers alike. Hydrate the existing VMs. Yeah. We're looking very much at our partners. Like Veeam is the first one to the story. They just are.
Yeah,
and don't get me wrong, we're working with a lot of others, but Veeam currently has plans to have theirs GA'd and ready to go. We've actually got the build bits that they need to be able to integrate in, dropping in private preview in our January release. So when we drop 2601 on January 20th, we're actually going to light up the preview testing for the ability to actually utilize the third-party tools like Veeam to do the migrate with the Hydrate experience for BCDR. So from a timeline perspective, we're looking at the second half of this year from a GA of that capability. Although again, because Veeam is ahead of the story, and I think Rubrik's not that far behind them, look for the announcements from your solution partners starting in that March-April timeframe and cascading throughout the year. What I'm positioning on the second half of the year is our first-party capabilities for the solution specifically. And that will happen when we reduce the mock dependencies on the resource bridge. At that point, we can actually get Hydrate across the line in a way that's more efficient. We ran into a ton of challenges with the mock dependencies.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
The second question was, let me look up in the chat. Oh my God, I lost the track maybe.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure. I may have to go back after we all drop and look through these and respond to a few.
Guys, I think I lost the second question. Sorry. Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, wonderful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, you can look. Ellen, it might help if you jump back to slide 20 for Mohammed's question. So the question is there any plan to support storage replica on Azure Local?
Yep. So storage replica on Azure Local actually already, Hyper-V replica already exists, and we use components of that for actually the Rack-aware clustering capabilities. So what we've done is focused on the Hyper-V replica specifically. Where I think the storage replica gets to be an interesting conversation is when you think about the investments that are being made in the SAN attached space, because at that point you're now using their replication for anything that is going to be required, and we're just presenting essentially that storage to the Azure Local solution. I have not heard that we're going to be repositioning anything specifically beyond that, but again, the Hyper-V replica is there, it's in place, it's fully GA'd, and it's an integral part to that Rack-aware solution I was talking about as well.
And then I'll just parrot the common request from 20 people over the last month. If we could get nice Hyper-V replica management from the Azure portal, I think we'd be all very happy about that.
I think we all would be too. And I think there's work that's been, I know there's work that's been done to prep for Rack-aware that's going to open up some capabilities for that and give us a little bit more of a portal experience. But that's certainly something I can remind Daniel Lee about.
All right. Any last questions before we sign off here?
Looks like Carl might have one more.
Yeah, I just came back. So when you were talking about mock dependency is resolved in a different way with the hydration, does it mean that it's also addressing some of the limitations? So, for example, restarting hosts or restarting VM in a proper manner?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work to simplify the resource bridge experience. Look for the announcements around mid-year to go into public preview for that, where we'll start seeing more customers take advantage of that capability, and then look at like ignite this year, that November, December timeframe for more of a GA around that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right. Well, okay. Last quick one, I think, for Mohammed. Just you ASR from Azure Local to the cloud. Can you fail back?
So you can. There are some limitations right now with the Arc agent tree, which is why we prioritize working with those partners to actually help with that. And then if you look at the work that we're doing that we were just talking about with the reducing the complexity of the resource bridge and reducing the mock dependencies and then bringing that hydration functionality toward the end of this year, that is actually what's going to give you the ability to do it. So site recovery, being able to use those things, yes, it works, like you can do it, but it's not a comfortable experience today. And what we're working on is to give you a better portal experience, but also to give you an experience that's going to integrate all of the work that needs to happen for that Arc agent to understand where you failed over and failed back. So 100%. And if that's something that you need sooner, that is, again, exactly what we're working on with Veeam and Rubrik and Commvault and others, is the ability to actually fail up to Azure, fail back down to the same cluster, fail to a different cluster, and have all that Arc agent tree automatically integrated so that your experience never changes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alan, for all the great information today. Thank you for everyone that was able to join us and ask some great questions. And hopefully we'll do this again in a couple months.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone.